Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Mixed Methods Research with NVivo webinar. I'll be introducing our host in a second. This is part of our webinar series, Evolving Research in Qualitative and Mixed Methods. I'm Stacy Penna. I'm the Customer Engagement and Enablement Director here at Lumivero, and I've been working with qualitative research for some time and working first with QSR, and now it's Lumivero for over 10 years. So excited to be part of this webinar series. And now for our guest today, Dr. Jane Elliott. She's a sociologist who has been using software packages to aid the analysis of qualitative data for over 30 years. She has a particular interest in combining qualitative and quantitative approaches to analysis and the use of narrative as a research tool. Her current work focuses on successful aging, well-being in middle life, and planning for the future. So welcome, Jane.
Thanks. Nice to be here. Thanks very much, Stacey. That's a great, lovely introduction, and thanks for doing the poll. Really pleased to be here with you. For me, it's late afternoon. For many of you, it's different parts of the day. I'm aware that you're all in very different places. It was great to see from the chat people from all over the world. And I'm also aware that you're from very different places in terms of how much experience you've already got with using NVivo. So I'm hoping to give you a very sort of broad overview this afternoon on how I've been using NVivo to do some mixed methods research. And let's just make sure I can go to the next slide. So I want to give you sort of the overview of the different topics that I'm going to be covering. So it's a way of introduction. I'll just go through these sort of key points. So firstly, I'm going to be focusing on how to leverage the capabilities of NVivo for conducting mixed methods research. So what is it about NVivo that makes it particularly appropriate for mixed methods? But I'm keeping it fairly specific in that I'm going to be looking at how we analyze textual responses to open-ended questions that are embedded within a quantitative survey. But I'd like to make the point that this approach is applicable to any data that includes both very structured or quantitative data and some textual data. So, for example, I can imagine you could use it to analyze a whole set of tweets or other sort of social media posts. And I'm hoping that you will all be able to see through the presentation how you might be able to apply it to the type of data that you're interested in. But rather than talking completely in the abstract, I want to give you some examples from a project that I've been doing, analysing qualitative responses from individuals aged 50, who we asked to write about how they imagined their future life at age 60. So we've got a nice sort of tangible, practical example to look at. And I thought it would be important at the beginning to just state that for me, mixed methods is a research approach where the researchers collect and analyse both quantitative and qualitative data within the same study. So I'm very much talking about bringing together quantitative and qualitative approaches. So throughout the session, I'm going to try and give you some very practical examples and talk through how I've been using NVivo in a practical way. I would say I've been perhaps a little bit shy of actually doing NVivo work online with you. It seemed to me that was a bit too risky, but I did want to make sure you saw some NVivo screenshots and you get some very sort of real ways of seeing how I've used NVivo in practice. But I'm also going to be giving you some sort of conceptual overview, particularly at the beginning. And I think it's important to say from the beginning that if you want to follow this up in further details, I wrote a paper in the summer, which is published in the qualitative report called The Craft of Using NVivo 12 to Analyse Open-Ended Questions. So that's a sort of go-to place if you want a step-by-step guide. And then in a more sort of conceptual frame, I wrote a book back in 2005, but it's still well used, published by Sage, about using narrative in social research. And this is looking at both qualitative and quantitative approaches to research and how we might put them together. So hopefully those are some useful resources. And I would say there's a list of resources at the end of my presentation, and Stacey will be sharing those with you, as well as sharing resources through the chat. And I also want to come clean from the beginning that my paper in the qualitative report was motivated by reading a paper that was written back in 2019, which again is a very helpful step-by-step introduction on how to analyse open-ended responses in surveys. But I would say that these authors made a couple of what I would call errors in their paper. Well, the first one is definitely an error, that they didn't understand the use of stop words in NVivo. So that's something very practical that I'm going to highlight today. And the other thing, which wasn't so much an error, but they were using an older version of NVivo, and they were using matrix query, which I find a very cumbersome way of trying to do mixed methods research. And I'm going to show you the crosstab query, which is a much more accessible, straightforward way of doing analysis. So again, in terms of a sort of conceptual framework, I've got this rather colourful roadmap of how I'm thinking about mixed methods. And I would say that what's clearly missing here is, first of all, you've got to collect your data. I've started by saying understand the structure of your data, because when you're thinking about how you're interacting with NVivo, you need to understand how NVivo has ingested your data. So that's why I'm starting with understanding the structure of data. But clearly, you've got to start with some data, either secondary data analysis, which is what I spend a lot of my time doing, or collecting your own new data. And what I've done in this rather colourful slide is I've highlighted in orange the things that NVivo can really help you with. So I'm going to be going through in more detail how you import your data to NVivo using the very helpful import survey import wizard. Then thinking through how you're going to code the qualitative elements of your mixed methods data set. And I'm going to highlight using word frequency queries, sentiment analysis, and codes based on text search queries. Now, clearly, many of you will already have used NVivo and will already have an in-depth understanding of how you use NVivo to do your own coding. So I'm going to try and frame this much more in a mixed methods way. And then I want to really sort of explore the way that there's an iterative process where you do some initial coding, but then you need to refine or aggregate your codes so that you're getting up off the data into categories and concepts. And perhaps, the sort of crux of the mixed methods aspect of using NVivo is in this light blue box, the analysis, and how we see how qualitative concepts link to the attributes of cases, or the more quantitative aspects of cases. And that's where I've put in orange that NVivo really helps us with a crosstab query. Now, in the background here, we've got my sort of thought cloud about keeping a reflexive journal to record progress. Now, I've found this particularly useful in NVivo because I'm not able to do research full time. I have to put it between other tasks that I have at work, at the university. I'm sure many of you have that experience as well. So using the memo function in NVivo is really helpful to keep track of what I'm doing, but also to generate ideas and hypotheses. So that's another facet of NVivo that's helpful for mixed methods research. And then clearly, finally, you're going to be writing up and presenting your research findings, and that's informed by your literature review and your conceptual framework. And I know that there are other resources out there which sort of explain how you can actually use NVivo to do some of that writing and how to structure your writing. I'm not going to cover that in detail today. I'd have to go much too fast, and I can't speak that quickly. So that's a sort of roadmap. Now, to give you a more metaphorical way of thinking about mixed methods data, I rather like the slightly nasty fairy tale about Rumpelstiltskin. And the key metaphor here is the idea of spinning straw into gold. So some of you might know the grim fairy tale Rumpelstiltskin, where he's got this special skill and he's able to help a miller's daughter spin ever-increasing roomfuls of straw into gold. And my point here is that mixed methods research can feel rather overwhelming just because of the quantity of data that we might have. We have too much straw, so text or empirical material, and we're trying to spin it into something more valuable, into our golden concepts and themes. But that's not the end of it. So just having golden thread is not enough. We need to then weave these into our research reports. So I'm sort of suggesting here that NVivo is a modern day Rumpelstiltskin. It's what's going to help us spin our straw into gold, but we still need to do a whole lot of additional work ourselves with that golden thread. So let's move on to the next slide. Sorry, my computer's being a little bit slow today. And so the key topics I want to cover are firstly, the importance of understanding the structure of your data, then how you might use text searches to help you with more automatic or semi-automatic coding. And as I explained briefly earlier, I'm going to highlight the importance of understanding stop words and how NVivo uses those. Then talk a little bit about refining coding with a specific example. And then the key part towards the end of my presentation is around using crosstab queries. And this is where the idea of mixed methods research for me really comes together in NVivo, because you're able to use crosstab queries to analyze the relationships between the codes that you've developed from your qualitative data and the attributes that you've imported, that's the quantitative data that you've collected or that's in your secondary data set. What you're trying to do is to understand the patterns in your data and the relationships, but you're also using NVivo able to move backwards and forwards between the more quantitative summaries and the qualitative detail that you've got in your data. So I said that I would center this around an exemplar project. So let's spend a couple of minutes just familiarizing you with this exemplar project. I won't go into too much detail, but just enough so you understand the nature of the data. So what I'm going to be showing today is some data from a survey that was embedded within a very long-standing longitudinal study called the 1958 British Birth Cohort Study. So it originally focused on 17,000 births in 1 week in March in 1958. And this study, it's longitudinal, it's followed people all the way through their lives, collecting lots of quantitative data, very structured data. It's always had that sort of quantitative mindset. And at age 50, when people were 50 in 2008, there was a lot of data collected, an interview, but also in a self-completion questionnaire. And although the self-completion questionnaire had mainly multiple choice questions, there was a final open-ended question, which asked people to imagine your life at age 60. So if I show you the survey, this was like the front page and second page of the survey, and it's an extract from this age 50 self-completion questionnaire. You can immediately see the sort of quantitative hallmarks of lots of boxes, asking people to put themselves in one box or another. The final two pages you can see here at the very end, question 21, asks people to imagine they're now 60 years old. Please write a few lines about the life you're leading, your interests, home life, health and well-being, and any work you may be doing. So this was a way of eliciting some qualitative material and really letting these cohort members have some sort of say about how they wanted to present themselves. And just to give you the flavour of the data without going into it in too much detail, so here are a couple of examples of qualitative responses. So the first woman wrote in capitals, as most of my life has been looking after family, I would hope I will still be healthy enough to enjoy the rest of my life, taking it easy and having time to enjoy the later years of my life. Retired full stop. And another woman wrote, I'm now 60 years old and left the UK with my daughter and 2 granddaughters. We're now living in the Maldives. I'm married and leading a happy life, plenty of sun and free time to myself and helping my husband run a successful restaurant business. I sometimes take or pick up the grandchildren from school, and it's good to see us feel so happy. So 2 slightly different, but very sort of typical responses. So this is what I'm meaning here about qualitative data, this textual data. So then moving on to think about the structure of this data. Just get it to move along. So we might think of the data as being like a rectangular data set. So each row of the rectangular data set is a case, in this case, an individual cohort member who's age 50, and each column of the data set is a variable. And this is what would be called an attribute in NVivo. So you can see along the top here, NCDS ID is the unique identifier within the data set. We've got thousands of cases available to us to analyze. The next column, word count, is how many words somebody used to answer the question. And then here's our really key qualitative variable here, imagine. So this is where the textual data is. And you can see the first response here, just 8 words. Very sadly, I don't imagine I'll ever reach 60 years. And then I won't go through all the other variables, but you can see gender here coded as 2 for women, as it's typically done in Britain, and 1 for men. So the very beginning here, we've got quite a few women and then a man down here at the bottom. So what's key about NVivo is that it has this very handy survey import wizard that enables us to get up and running with doing mixed methods research. So as I say, I'm not going to give you a sort of live real-time demonstration of using NVivo, but I hope if you go back through my slides and use some of the other resources on the web, then you can follow through and actually do your own mixed methods research. So here is simply the import main menu, and then you're importing a survey, but this is a survey with some qualitative data as part of it. And then my data was in Excel, but you can import text files and also from proprietary survey companies like Qualtrics and SurveyMonkey. And this then very neatly takes you through a survey wizard. So the survey import wizard allows you to check your data format, to manage the survey respondents, and to identify your open-ended and your closed questions. We'll just have a little look at this. So the survey import wizard, this is what you'll see on the left-hand side of your screen. This is what you'll see in NVivo. And here you can see very clearly, imagine is being highlighted by NVivo. I haven't had to specify this. It's just guessed that this is my open-ended question because there's lots of text there. And again, you can see the preview. This is that very first case with a word count of 8 and this rather sad, very brief answer. And if you haven't used NVivo very much in the past, or you haven't used it for mixed methods research, it's worth noting that the closed-ended questions are called attributes in NVivo. We might call them variables as quantitative researchers. And the open-ended question is the qualitative part, and that's going to be entered into NVivo as a code that then you can do further coding with. So the 5th step, the final step of the survey import wizard, allows you to auto-code some of the themes in your data and the sentiment. So when I say it allows you to do the auto-coding, of course, it allows NVivo to auto-code for you. I always just leave these checked by default because I think it's always interesting to see what NVivo might do, but it's not always that successful, as we'll see in just a moment. So then the important thing, once you've got the data within NVivo, is again to understand the sort of structure of your data and how NVivo has ingested it. So you can note here that the variable names along the top, NCDS ID, word count, imagine, gender, etc., are identical to those in the original data that I showed you. But NVivo has added for us this extra ID variable that simply counts the number of respondents that we've got here. The other important thing to say here is that when I used NVivo years ago, I was importing individual files, which were generally transcripts from interviews. So I might typically have done 30 interviews. And when I looked at NVivo, or Nudist as it was then, I got 30 separate files, and each file was a 20, 40-page transcript. This way of doing mixed methods research within NVivo, you just have one file, and your one file has got your quantitative data, your attributes, but also your qualitative data. So hopefully we'll understand more about that in just a minute. So as I mentioned, when importing the survey file, NVivo is automatically creating a code for all of the qualitative responses. And in this case, because of the way the variables were labeled, it's called imagine. So this means it's straightforward for you to do some further coding, either manually or semi-automatically. So this here, you can see I've circled in red the Imagine code. It's got 481 references because I didn't put all of the thousands and thousands of cases in. As an exemplar, I've put 481 cases into NVivo for this particular bit of analysis. And you can see that by clicking on that Imagine code on the right-hand panel, I've then got the actual answers that people have given me. So here I've got number 214 to 217 listed here. So that's what it would look like within NVivo. And you could then go through and do your manual coding. So moving along, I mentioned that NVivo will also auto code for you. So you can auto code some themes, and it automatically does this. So this is the themes. These are the themes that NVivo came up with for me from that corpus of 481 responses that I imported. So you can see things like interests, ill health, home life, and then a count of how many times that's referenced. So I highlighted friends, and you can see the sorts of things that people wrote about friends. But NVivo themselves say text analytics is complex and manual coding is always going to be more accurate. So this is only going to give you a rough sense of what themes are in the data. And then another very automatic thing that NVivo will do for you is to do a sentiment analysis, and it will literally sort of use machine learning to read every response and code them in terms of overall whether they're positive or negative, and then within that whether they're very positive or moderately positive, and within the negative whether they're moderately negative or very negative. So what I've done here is I've clicked on very negative, the 51 people that NVivo had automatically said their sentiment was very negative. And so you can see the beginning of that in the right-hand pane. And depending on how big your screen is, you'll be able to read some of these. And I've highlighted in red where NVivo really seems to have made a mistake to me. I still have very close bond with my children and family and friends. Now, to me, that doesn't sound very negative. That sounds positive. And again, this comes back to the point that NVivo makes, that manual coding is always going to be more accurate than doing the automatic coding. So one of the issues you're going to need to think about as a researcher is whether you've got so much data that you don't mind there being a bit of noise in the data, and you're going to let NVivo do a lot of the heavy lifting for you in terms of coding, or whether really you want to go in and code the qualitative material yourself. So I'm going to pause briefly before moving to the next section of my presentation about how you might do coding in more detail. And so I'm going to hand over to Stacey for a moment to see if there's a couple of questions that people have got so far.
Sure, we have, yes, we do have questions. But so with like a huge research project, we have thousands of participants. So when you're using NVivo or another software, is the only way to do it is to bring it in as a spreadsheet like that?
So yes, I mean, there are different formats of the spreadsheet that you can do, but that's with that many cases, you're not going to want to bring it all in as separate files. So yes, I would say this is the way to do it.
And then here's a question. What happens when you're getting the data over a period of time? Example, qualitative responses are coming in over a 6 months period. This means that the Excel sheet to be imported won't be a complete data set over 6 months. Is there a way to update it?
Yes, so NVivo will allow you to add more data in. But I would always make sure I know how to do that right at the beginning of the project. But I've certainly done that in the past where we've needed to update data by adding in more data. So yeah, you could certainly do that. That shouldn't be a problem. And the other thing that you can do is you can also merge projects in NVivo. There's all sorts of ways of working with NVivo as members of the team. So you could have somebody working on one project on some of the early data and someone else working on another project, some of the later data, and then merge them and be able to actually interrogate the differences between the different styles of coding. I mean, there's a huge number of things that you can do, which I'm not going to have time to cover now. But in a way, if you can conceptualize the question, you can usually do it in NVivo. And I found that the sort of help and advice in NVivo, the sort of forum community of people helping, it's been very responsive to find ways around those sort of practical questions. Great questions, thank you.
Yeah, and so following up, so what I'm going to do in the chat is I'm going to do a link to a past webinar we did showing how to do mixed methods in NVivo. So I've shared, I'll do that, and also share our new Lumavero community. And if you join it, it has an NVivo resource section that will help you with surveys and different types of data that you want to import into NVivo. So those are some resources on how to use NVivo I'll share. So thanks, Jean.
Great, that's really helpful, thank you. So moving on to think about coding, and then in the final part of the webinar, I'm going to be talking about doing crosstab queries as a way of really analysing your data and bringing the qualitative and the quantitative together. So the way that I would start, and that I have started in the past to do my analysis and my coding, is to use a word frequency analysis and then use that to lead me into doing very specific text searches. And the reason I'm conceptualizing it in this way is that when I've got lots of little bits of qualitative data from a wide range of people, then I want a way of quickly interrogating all that qualitative material, rather than when I've got a few interviews and I really want to just upload those interviews into my head and I'm sort of reading them through in detail. So using these semi-automatic elements of NVivo, we can firstly do a word frequency analysis, summarizing the most frequently occurring words, and then we can do some text searches. So moving to the word frequency query. So this is the dialog box that you would get if you ask to do a word frequency query from the Explore menu in NVivo. And you can see by default, it suggests it's going to display for me the 100 most frequent words. That seems sensible. With minimum length 1, I could increase that, obviously. And then what I find useful is to actually do some grouping of the words so that NVivo is seeing words like talk, talking, and talked as actually the same word. It's grouping them together when it's counting the frequencies of words. So I usually do the grouping with stemmed words. But you can see here, there's really a lot of variability in the way that you can set this up. So applying this to the particular data set I've shown you, where people are imagining they're 60, there are 2 different ways of displaying this, or at least 2 ways in NVivo. So the first is a word cloud, and you can see in orange there the 6 most frequently used words. And you can see that that exactly corresponds with the first 6 listed in the table on the right-hand side. So you can see health listed right up there, that 146 people use the word health. It comes up, well, not necessarily 146 people, but the word health comes up 146 times in this corpus. So I would argue that this word frequency query is already a very powerful tool for understanding some of the key themes in your data. So in this data, we could see that some of the key themes seem to be positivity. So we had words appearing very frequently like hoping, enjoying, happy, good, and able. And also I found a lot of stability. So people imagining their life at 60 would be very much the same as their life at 50. So lots of people using the word still. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the key topics rather than the themes are things like work, health, family, and their interests. And of course, that was prompted in the question, the way the open-ended question was asked. But this is where I just want to have a slightly technical diversion, because this has tripped me up in the past and is what other people have got wrong in their papers. So this is the importance of stop words. I don't quite know why they're called stop words. Somebody else might know and might put it in the chat. And Stacey, feel free to tell me at the end. But stop words are basically words that are ignored in word frequency queries, and in text search queries, stop words are effectively invisible to NVivo. And you can go into NVivo, and I'll give you the instructions in just a moment, and look at and change what it's using as the stop words. So in the box on the right-hand side, you can see a list of the default stop words in English in NVivo. And you can see some of them like a and as and at and be are pretty innocuous, and you probably would want to keep them as stop words. But there's sometimes words like not, where depending on the qualitative questions you're asking, the sort of research questions you have, you might be really interested in who uses the phrase, I will not be doing this when I'm 60, as sort of they're using a negative way of expressing themselves. So not doing something, you may well want to actually search for that. So it's important to be able to amend these stop words to make them appropriate for your particular project. So on the next slide and in your handouts, you will have this how to modify the stop words within NVivo. And I've put a link at the bottom where you can get even more information about this. But I think it's more useful now for you to see the way that it changes the word cloud you get. So on the left-hand side, you can see the word cloud that I showed you before. So this is the NVivo default. So I haven't got any stop words in my word cloud, in other words. But then if I include all the words, so I had fun and just went in and deleted all the stop words, and you can see the words are rather different now. So the top 6 include the, and will. So, not very helpful, but you can again see this word not appearing as something that people use quite often, that they're keen to tell me as the researcher what they're not doing at age 60 as much as what they are doing. So I hope this is a useful feature for you to understand. And I came a cropper with it years ago when I was doing some other qualitative analysis. And I was trying to find out what people were saying, and they were using the word not. And whenever I did a text search on not, it said it doesn't appear. And I thought, well, yes, the word not is there. And I asked for help, and it was to do with stop words. So that's a slightly technical aside, but hopefully a useful one. And now thinking about how we use the text search feature as an aid to coding. So I've certainly found that when I've got large quantities of texts in mixed methods research, it's very helpful to use this text search feature. And the reason this is so helpful is that when you do an automatic search for a particular word or specified text, you can save it as a new code, or what used to be called a node in NVivo. And you need to be aware that the default settings in NVivo only code the word itself, but you will often want to see and understand the context. So you can look at the context by spreading your coding to a custom context, as I will show you. So this is what the dialog box would look like in NVivo. So you can see here I've actually specified I'm searching for the word not, so I've already got rid of that from the stop words. You can see that as default, I put find with stemmed words. That's on that sort of right-hand side in that top panel. And then you can also see that I've spread the coding. And in this case, I've said to the entire text. And because this will not be all the text in the file, it will be the text that belongs to that particular respondent, that particular survey case. And then, as well as just being able to run this as a query, you can also choose run and save results. And this is then a way of creating a code based on the text that you're searching for. So I'll move on to give you some examples. It can be a bit dry talking about this in the abstract. And also I want to talk a little bit about how you might refine or aggregate your coding as a step towards doing some cross-tab mixed methods analysis. So when you do your initial individual coding using a text search query, in a way you're doing what's called indexing the data. And I've got a reference in my resources by another Elliot, not any relation of mine, but she very much talks about indexing your data. But these are then quite granular codes, and you may want to refine them or aggregate them to form parent codes or categories. And there's lots of books about qualitative coding and different ways of doing it, and there's slightly different terms used by different schools of thought in qualitative research. So I'm aware I'm talking in quite general terms here, but what I want to bring through to you is that the strength of NVivo is that you can easily manipulate codes. I sometimes think of codes as a bit like containers, and you put things in a sort of digital container within NVivo, and then you can easily split that into sub-containers, or you can aggregate it up into a bigger container. So let's get back to our practical example about people imagining their life at age 60 and what they wrote about. So we spotted that people said a lot about their interests. And of course, there's quite a lot of different types of interests that people have. You can see a list here, including fishing, darts, dancing, swimming, walking, knitting, painting, reading. And if you skim along the right-hand column, you can see in particular that walking at 27 and reading at 20 were some of the sort of real key favourite interests. But for me, those were slightly too granular as codes. So then you can see how I've created two more conceptual codes. One is active interests and a separate one for passive interests. And to be honest with you, I was looking at this earlier, and I did this a while ago, and I was thinking, why did I put snooker as an active interest? I'm sure there'll be people out there who are thinking snooker's not really very active. Maybe you have to get yourself to the snooker hall, but then there's not a huge amount of activity compared with running or swimming. But anyway, be that as it may, I suppose it reveals the subjective nature of coding, and darts as well perhaps is not a very active interest. But hopefully you can see what I'm getting at here. And certainly I would see reading as a passive interest. And birds, if you're bird watching, you probably have to stay pretty still. But I'm making the broad point here that NVivo is allowing you to aggregate these codes. And this is then what's bringing us on to being able to use cross-tab queries, because cross-tab queries are going to work best when you've actually got quite substantial numbers in your codes. And you're really here bringing together the qualitative and quantitative elements of your data. So the way that I'm going to be using cross-tab queries here is to examine the patterns of your responses. And for those of you who've done lots of quantitative research, you'll know that a cross-tab is just simply a table with rows and columns. In this case, in NVivo, your codes are usually in your rows, and you can have multiple codes in a cross-tab table. You can look at lots of codes at the same time. And then your attributes are going to be in your columns. And the cells of the table show the patterning of those codes by different attributes. And one of the neat things within NVivo is that you can present your data in a number of different ways. If you like color, you can color code the cells in the table to see where most coding occurred. But the other thing that's really neat is you can double click on a cell and you can see the data that's coded into that cell. I'll show you that in just a moment. But the point here is that we're moving from the quantitative summary to the qualitative context. And this then is really at the nub of how NVivo is helping you to do mixed methods research, because it's all about moving backwards and forwards between the qualitative and the qualitative and the quantitative. And for those of you who've got a long history of using NVivo, and I'm sure there's some of you out there who've done a lot of NVivo in the past, the crosstab query is basically a matrix coding query. So it's not wrong to use a matrix coding query. It's just that the crosstab query is a simplified version. It makes it much simpler to do your particular piece of analysis, and yeah, much quicker and easier to do it. Now, the other thing that is important to make a point of here is that NVivo doesn't yet, I don't know if it ever will, think of including, doesn't have any statistical tests embedded within it. It's still very much focused on the qualitative. And so if you do want to do some statistical significance tests, you would need to export your data into a software package such as R, SPSS, or Stata. NVivo makes that very straightforward. You can simply, output your data and then analyze it in one of those statistical packages. And by exporting the data, I mean you can export particular sets of cases, all your cases, and the code. So you've got the frequencies there that you can do the analysis of at an individual level. But let's have a little bit more of a look in detail at the crosstab tool in NVivo. So once again, we're going to our explore part of the NVivo menu, and then we're going into the queries submenu, and you can see that the second option there is to do a crosstab. So I'm doing explore, queries, and then crosstab. And then underneath, you can see the way that you set it up. So on the left-hand side, there's a nice big box, and you can either drag and drop, or as you know, there's many ways of putting things into NVivo. But here I've put in my active interests and my passive interests. And because I was doing this in a slightly older version of NVivo to the one I'm using now, I think this is in NVivo 12, it still calls them nodes, active interests and passive interests, whereas the most up-to-date, I think, calls them codes, but it's basically the same idea. And then what I'm saying is I want a crosstab which looks at these particular codes by one of my quantitative variables, and here I've chosen gender. And the classification that comes under is survey respondent, just because I've imported a survey here. Now, if you're sharp-eyed, you'll see that there's scope underneath attribute 1 to put a second attribute. So you can actually do nested tables. So if I'd got people of different ages, I could look at men and women who are young and old. Here, everyone's the same age. They're all age 50 answering this question. But you can build these sort of nested tables if you want to do something very sophisticated. So let's have a look at our data in this format and look at a first output here. So you can see on the left-hand side, labeling the rows, the active interests and the passive interests. And you can see labeling the columns, gender equals 1 is the men, and gender equals 2 is the women, the second sex, unfortunately here. And we here in the top table, you can see we've got the raw numbers. So this is basically saying there were 16 men who had some sort of active interests that they were imagining that they were doing at age 60, whereas there were 35 women who had active interests. Now, the great thing about NVivo is it doesn't just restrict you to presenting the raw numbers like this. You can also turn it into percentages. So below, you can see that just expressed as percentages. So the 16 is going to be 6.67% of 240. That's the way to think about it. And of course, once you've presented it as percentages, it's easier to make the comparison. So we're saying about 14% of women talk about active interests. So that's about twice as many women as men, where there's only about 6.7% of men who are talking about active interests, whereas the passive interests is pretty similar across men and women. But generally, I'd say women seem to imagine themselves as being more interesting at age 60 than the men do. I hope you don't mind my jokes. So the thing that I would just niggle about here is the fact that the percentages look so precise. Really, we would be taught not to give it to 2 decimal places. That's a bit unrealistic, but that's the way NVivo presents it. Now, before giving you another example of a crosstab, it's worth just having a little technical digression again to talk about what we mean by cases and references in NVivo, because the other thing about NVivo is it's very flexible, whether you want to be thinking in terms of references as your unit of analysis or cases. So we just need to be clear what we mean by those. So cases and references in NVivo, I've gone back to an example from the very beginning. You hopefully remember this little bit of text, this very optimistic woman who's imagining herself at age 60, living in the Maldives. And I've highlighted in yellow here 2 places where she talks about grandchildren. So the first place, she talks about leaving the UK with my daughter and 2 granddaughters. She's very specific about grandchildren. And then later on, she says, I sometimes take or pick up my grandchildren from school. So if you were coding this, you may well have coded these 2 pieces of text separately. You might well, so this would then count as 2 references. So although this is the response of one individual person or one case, what I've highlighted in yellow are 2 separate extracts or references that could be coded as being about grandchildren. And when you're carrying out a crosstab analysis in NVivo, what's clever is you can specify whether you want the numbers in the cells to refer to cases or to references. And of course, if you think logically about this, the number of cases will always be fewer than the number of references. So one case can have many references within it. And you've got to bear in mind here that the example I'm giving you, this particular data set, the pieces of qualitative text are really quite short. So often the cases and the references will be pretty similar. But if you're dealing with more text, then you may well find that you've got a lot of references, a lot of separate references within a particular case. And depending on how you're framing your research question, you might be interested in looking at one or the other. So let's look at a slightly different example, but from the same overall set of data. So again, the eagle-eyed amongst you might notice that my total sample size has changed. That is because my original 481 people that I did some research on, I'd particularly chosen people who were registered as disabled or having some sort of long-term illness. And I did some research using their answers. And here I've done a particular selection of 185 individuals to make sure they're representative of the whole sample. So although I started off with thousands of individuals, I've actually used within SPSS, which is the quantitative package I use that to do a subsample. So that's another little aside about mixed methods research, is that you don't always have to use all your data. You may want to subset your data so that you can really pay attention to the qualitative material. So that's a bit of preamble, but I hope you can see the figures here and that they're starting to make sense to you. So let's look at the top panel. So overall, we've got 185 people, real people. 92 of them are men, 93 of them are women. And here, what I did was I did lots of individual codes about health and what people were saying about their health. And then again, I aggregated these up into 3 broad categories. So first, whether people were writing about their health in a negative way, then whether they're writing about their health in a neutral way, and whether they're writing about their health in a positive way. So there were those sort of 3 main categories. And here I've chosen to color code my text. So you can see what NVivo's done is it's highlighted that people are generally more positive about their health, and particularly we've got women being positive about their health. So we've got 61 cases, 61 women who have got some sort of positive statement about their health. And again, here you can see a slight gender difference, that the women are being more positive about their health than the men, because we've got 61 versus 48. And then if we look at negative, the men are more likely to be negative. We've got 28 of them being negative compared to 19 women. Now that's where we're using as our unit of analysis the actual person, the respondent, but underneath it, I've done the analysis in a slightly different way. I've just changed this in NVivo. It was a simple right click and then selecting that the cell content I wanted was coded references. And so as we would predict, you can see our total number of codes gone up from 153 to 181. And you can see in each cell, we've got almost all the cells, we've got just 1 or 2 more. So I'm hoping this just is illustrating to you the difference between references and cases. So let's just focus on one particular example. So let's focus on something positive. So there's 61 women who are being positive about their health. And then if you look at the lower table, there are 64 references to positive health within the women's samples. That means that 3 women probably have said two positive things. There's 2 codes relating to positivity in those cases. So as I mentioned, and we're coming towards the end now before having some time for questions. What I really like about NVivo is it doesn't just leave you with these tables. To me, these tables don't really feel like mixed methods research. What's missing here is the qualitative nature of the data. But simply by clicking on a cell, you can then get the actual references, the actual comments that people made. So you can see at the top here, it tells me this is my data set with 185 cases for NVivo, and there are 64 references coded. So this is my positive women. And perhaps a nice way of summarizing these is reference 4 here. Someone saying, I'm fit, healthy, slightly mischievous 60-year-old woman who doesn't look her age. What a lovely positive thing to end on. But I'm hoping this shows you how you can go backwards and forwards between the positive and not just between the positive and the negative, but between the qualitative and the quantitative. And of course, this then means that you can check out whether things really are in the right categories, whether you actually want to move things into other categories. And NVivo is very good at undoing code. So nothing is ever set in stone in NVivo. So that's a good thing about it. And then obviously when writing up, you can use some of these as examples. And I'm sure you'll be able to think of lots of other ways in which you can use these facilities of moving between the positive and the negative. So as I mentioned, I've got a number of resources that I've listed at the end of my presentation, which will be accessible to all of you. Thanks all of you out there all over the world for listening to me, and now an opportunity for a few more questions, I hope. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jane. That was excellent. Tons of positive comments about the presentation. I'm just going to share my screen quickly just to show some other references too that people can use. Sorry, my so we're going down here. So I just want to mention that NVivo 14 will be out soon. If you buy the current version of NVivo, which is NVivo 2020, you get the upgrade automatically. So if you want to buy NVivo, don't stop. You can, and you'll get the upgrade. NVivo 14 has some new features like collaboration. So you can collaborate in real time if you have NVivo 14 and NVivo Collaboration Cloud. And also it integrates now with Citavi, our reference management and writing software. So that link you can get in the PDF if you want to sign up to get more information. Here are some free resources. So I think James shared some of these too, and I was trying to share them in our chat. We also have NVivo Academy. So some people asked about how they could be a certified expert on NVivo. So we have a course for that, and you can also find our trainers. More upcoming webinars. I'll put that in the chat when we take questions too, so you can register for these. And this, I also put in the chat the new Lumivero community. We have a ton of resources on how to use NVivo. It's free. You do have to have a new login, and you can then go to the resources and see videos and different things on how to use NVivo. The last thing, I just wanted to show how the software all works together. Citavi can help you with your lit review, and you can import that into NVivo to do more analysis. We have a partnership with iTrax, which helps you collect data online. We have NVivo transcription to help with your transcription. NVivo, obviously, NVivo collaboration for collaboration, Citavi to help you writing, and then our courses too. All right. So with that, I will stop sharing. One other thing I'm going to put in the chat, we're doing Silvana Di Gregorio, who is our product product director with NVivo is doing her own research on a survey on how people work online. So I'm going to put that in the chat too, if people don't mind doing that. Okay, so go to questions. So one question was, somebody asked, could you use the Delphi method of doing mixed methods, or are you familiar with that method, Jane, with NVivo?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, my familiarity with Delphi is that it's about sending out to a group of professional people, usually, and getting responses in writing from them. So it comes from the idea of the Delphic oracle, which was silent. So it's a silent way of doing, because it's all text-based. So as long as you can configure that data into a rectangular data set, as I described, so then you could certainly import it to NVivo and do mixed methods research. So what I would be imagining is you might have a panel of 50 or 60 people that you've sent out to, and you might send multiple requests for their opinions. Their opinions would be qualitative, and you can have more than one qualitative field that you're entering into NVivo. I was just showing a simple example with one, but that's a good question because it makes me think, yeah, you can definitely put more than one in. And then, of course, you'd have your quantitative data, which would be the attributes of the people who had responded. So it could be gender, it could be their work role, the length of time in their work role, and that would just be coded in the way that you would code any sort of attribute survey data or variables. So hopefully that's helpful.
Great, thank you. I do want to clarify, because you showed auto coding, which is a great feature of NVivo, but I just want to be clear. Some people had questions that you can still code your own data. So auto coding is meant just like to look across all your data sort of quickly to see what's there, and then it gets saved in a separate folder in NVivo. So you decide what you bring into your own coding, but you still will have to do your own coding, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point to emphasize. And I probably didn't emphasize enough just how long it takes to do the coding. You know, it really is a conceptual process. NVivo won't do your thinking for you. It just is a tool to help you.
So people had questions about the crosstab a lot. Apart from using crosstab techniques, or any other ways you bridge the gap between the quant and qual data? Example, connecting two sets of data.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing I didn't have time to get into, but you could always export your data and do things like qualitative comparative analysis, which Charles Reagan talks about. So you can do all sorts of, and basically NVivo is helping you to turn your qualitative data into some sort of code. So you can certainly do that. I think the difficulty is there are so many different ways of conceptualizing mixed methods that I wanted to give a practical example of how to do something. So I focused on crosstabs, but you're right, there's more than one way of doing it.
Yes, I think we have time for one more question. So PDF looking. Okay, so I will, the best I can, we have tons of questions. I will try to go back and answer these, especially when they're NVivo specific. Some of the research methods I might not be able to do as well as Jane, but if they're NVivo specific.
And I just saw something appear on chat. So just to be really clear, coding is not like computer programming coding. No, coding is what qualitative researchers talk about when they talk about looking at text and deciding what category or concept it belongs in. It's totally different from the sort of coding that you do on a computer.
Yes. And how much trust do you place in automated analysis when using, oh no, was that the one? Yeah, I think that. When using this as a summary, are there ways to counterbalance any of the unknown predictable error biases that you mentioned?
Yeah, so I wouldn't use, with these sort of size of samples, when you've got dozens or a few hundred, I would always do my code. I might do it semi-automatically by getting it to do a text search, but then I would go through and look at the text. So I would look for a word like still, which to me makes it sound like someone's thinking about stability, but then I would definitely look at 150 examples of how people use the word still, and some of them I would uncode because they might have used still because they were using a whiskey still to make a drink, or it might be a completely different use of the word still. So definitely I would always do some manual intervention, but it depends on the size of your sample.
Well, thank you. That's, I think, the time we have, but there's a short survey that comes up after this just to help us get better and understand what you need out of webinars. So if you don't mind taking that, but otherwise, thanks, Jane. It was very positively received and great information.
Great. Thanks very much. Lovely to meet you all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.